You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. The Trump administration is taking a new tack in its efforts to eliminate diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. Last Monday, Politico reported that the administration is proposing to change requirements within the General Services Administration so that any entity hoping to receive federal dollars via things like grants, loans, or insurance would need to fall in line with federal standards that ban DEI-based policies and programs. According to the notice, over 220,000 entities would be impacted by this change. It's the latest in a long line of actions by the Trump administration to remove DEI programming and policies from both public organizations and private companies. For many, the moves have signaled a retreat from the goal of creating more inclusive education and workspaces and an attempt to recenter whiteness and straightness in industry and education. But my next guest argues that the DEI policies most institutions had adopted were far from perfect, and that to meet our current moment, we need to rethink our relationship with race and racism. Dr. Relina L. Joseph is Vice Provost of Inclusive Excellence and Professor of African American Studies at UCLA. Her newest book is called Racial Exhaustion: How to Move Through Racism in the Wake of DEI. Dr. Joseph, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I guess first off, the title resonated with me, but I don't fully know what you mean. So I'll just say, what is racial exhaustion?
Yes, thank you for that. I get that reaction from lots of folks that before they have read a word, they kind of intuitively know what I mean. So I talk about racial exhaustion as being something that impacts all of us, regardless of our racial identity. I talk about how for people of color, that racial exhaustion can be not just experiencing racism, but the denial of racism. And so the denial that might happen certainly interpersonally, but in the ways in which you were talking about in your intro here, how it happens structurally as well, how these attempts to erode decades, centuries of progress are telling us that that's because racism simply does not exist. And we know that this is not the case. So that's what so much of our racial exhaustion might come from. For white folks, I talk about racial exhaustion as being from the place where race is the topic that they just do not want to talk about anymore. And it might be for liberal social justice folks being tired of having to continually prove their own anti-racist credentials. It might be that we've dealt with that issue already. 2020 is over. We need to think about other and different things. So I talk about how it surfaces for all of us, but just in really different ways.
I had two reactions to that definition. One is that as a white person, one of the things that I think contributes to that sense of exhaustion is fear of getting things wrong. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and I hear that a lot, not just fear of getting things wrong, but really fear of being canceled, right? And I absolutely hear that at this moment, that we have so little grace for each other in all kinds of ways of life, and that it can feel really scary to be able to speak up and to speak back. And we know that this is something that we can do and that all of us should do. And that learning how to, for example, speak up against racism is not an inherent or an inherited or melanin-based attribute, but rather is something that we can all learn. And so that's what I'm trying to provide some of the learning for in this book is how can we all be skilled up here?
The second reaction I had to that definition is that for some, the exhaustion is, deeply held in a feeling that they're feeling because they would like to leave the idea of race as like a central battle that is being fought behind. For some, it feels like a strategy. And maybe that's because I am a political reporter by training and I deal with American politics a lot. And I think that there is an assessment of the 2024 election that, to paraphrase Mark Maron, we annoyed the country into fascism. That's what, his phrase from his stand-up. And that basically talking too much about race, among many other things, trans issues and other issues of equity and diversity, created the scenario that, brought Donald Trump back to the White House. I mean, what do you think about that reasoning and why people kind of, the exhaustion is actually sort of also calculated?
Yeah, I hear that, and I would add as an asterisk that I think that part of it was that not all of us have been involved in the conversation. So those folks who have gone over to the fascist side have been able to opt out. So, for example, for this book, I brought together lots of groups of people to talk about race. And many of our white participants, who I won't say necessarily the good Seattleites, but they might have had cousins or uncles or grandparents who were kind of January 6th or January 6th adjacent, as they would describe them.
Oh, we had people in Seattle who attended January 6th too.
Yeah. Yeah, I was saying that a little tongue in cheek here, but also, so many of the folks that came in said, I don't have the energy to talk to Uncle Joe. I have to preserve myself at this moment, and I think that was a huge misstep. I think that particularly people who have in their family the folks who have trouble seeing the humanity of all of us, that is absolutely our privilege that we need to enact to be able to come in and say, let's actually have some conversations around this. And again, that's what I think, that there's not an inherent kind of quality, but we're able to do this if we work and practice.
You've defined the modern DEI moment as basically being from George Floyd to when the Supreme Court struck down affirmative action. It's a very short period of time. How would you consider kind of the rise and fall, what it's left us with, and where it left us when it comes to conversations about race?
Yeah, I have that really short timeline. It's a provocation, and there's no single kind of definition of when it happens. But to me, because I see so much performativity as happening alongside the era that was called DEI, I see a desire to have a lot of boxes checked off as opposed to significant structural changes made. And that's why I talk about it at that moment. And part of my argument is that we need to think about the much longer timeline of freedom movements. So of freedom struggles that have happened in this country for not just decades, but for centuries. And that this is the timeline that we need to be on. This is how we need to be kind of imagining ourselves right now and into the next moment, as opposed to 3 years when there were industries, and particularly corporate industries, that chose to say, oh yeah, I'm discovering racism for the first time, right? And I think we can do far more at this moment if we're not mourning that loss of those 3 years, and we're thinking strategically about how do we move forward together.
And you've talked about this tool that you call radical listening. And as a journalist, I kind of sat up because I'm always trying to think of ways to listen better. And like, you're kind of applying this to like the ways that we can approach race, in all kinds of aspects of our life. So what is radical listening?
Radical listening is a term that was coined by the critical pedagogy scholar Joe Kinchlow, and it's about really holding someone's words with the intent to understand and not the intent to reply. So it means listening with an open heart, an open mind, and not to achieve some point of agreement, but rather to just simply hear. And this is not the way that many of us listen, right? We're listening, thinking about, are we going to be building up our own arsenal of weapons in this argument I'm going to be making? Am I going to think about how I can even agree and how I can share out my own piece of my story? Or, with a lot of academics, what is the smartest way that I can respond, right? And so there's all this rehearsing that happens. There's all the strategizing that happens as opposed to simply sitting and trying to fully understand what this person is saying from their worldview. And so I really think that in order for us to communicate clearly and carefully and successfully across difference, including across race, we need to start with that process of radical listening.
I mentioned you're at UCLA now. Until August of last year, you were right next door at the University of Washington campus, right next door to our studios. You were Associate Dean of Equity and Justice for the Graduate School and the founder and director of the UW Center for Communication, Difference, and Equity. So you have been in these two big institutions, academic institutions, during what has become a really public battle between the Trump administration and higher ed about policies around who is, in the student body and, who is working at those schools and how they get money and funding. How has that looked from inside the walls, the Ivy walls or whatever, the academia walls?
I think that the way that many of us have made it forward is by looking at that long arc of history and understanding that this moment, while it is incredibly taxing, is probably just going to be a blip. We have to believe that. And moreover, we cannot stop the work. We can't stop the work of trying to make our universities into the most equal, fair places where we all can thrive. And, the folks who are in my line of business, so are in the work of inclusive excellence, and that's the language we use at UCLA, and I know that University of Washington is starting to lean into as well, understand that we have to do this work, or not even have to, that we are drawn to the work of justice. And justice is going to come about in different ways. It's going to be communicated in different ways. And we can't stop. So I think that one of the really beautiful things about this moment is how people are coming together to think through strategically, how do we continue to uplift our communities when it feels like they are being denigrated all of the time? And the strength, honestly, of our young folks, of our Gen Zs, who are really not taking a lot of this lying down, particularly the students that I've come to know at UCLA and everyone I worked with forever at the UW, that they are not going to let proclamations or lawsuits stop them. Right. And so I think that part of what we're trying to do as some of the adults in the spaces is to follow their lead and try and remember that this is for all of us, but this is really for them. This is for our next generation, that we need to continue this fight.
We are certainly in a backlash time against DEI. There's not just from the White House, but there have been reassessments of outcomes in a variety of venues, in a variety of spaces. I'm thinking particularly of some of the New York Times reporting on the University of Michigan and its DEI system, which has been mostly discontinued or at least changed dramatically in the last couple of years. The school had invested something like $250 million over a decade into diversity, equity, inclusion type programs. A lot of that, most of it going to salaries and benefits for DEI staff. But when you look at the actual number of undergraduates over that period of time, it remained virtually the same, the number of Black undergraduates at the University of Michigan. There were some gains when it came to first generation students. There were, some gains like that. But I think that this fairly got questioned about, where are we putting our resources and what are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And Michigan, again, has backed off of a lot of that spending and a lot of those policies. When you look at something like that, what kind of lessons did you draw? Or, do you think that the Michigan system was unfairly maligned? What did you take from that?
I do. I think that there are tremendous examples of what can and should happen in that Michigan model. The university's really wholesale commitment, I think, was inspiring. And I think we saw that the total or near total eradication was easier because the work was not distributed throughout the university. And so that's one of the biggest lessons that I have learned is that the work, and this is the work of inclusive excellence, that we're trying to hold the entire institution, the entire university, accountable for all of our success. So this means that as opposed to side programs, that the programs need to be integrated into every piece of the university. So that's the work that's really harder to do in some ways, that you really have to change the direction of these huge, ginormous institutions, these huge ships. But I think that's the way that we really institute change. And that has not been the way that we have done a lot of our DEI work.
I just want to circle back, and I know I'm not trying to get you to defend or get too specific on Michigan, but when you hear there was $250 million and these outcomes, the undergraduate outcomes stayed the same, I think that the shorthand for the Michigan example has become that this was a bureaucracy that got out of control and was just an industrial complex of DEI that didn't actually do anything for students. Do you think that that's wrong? Do you think that assessment is wrong?
I mean, I can see that argument, and I can see the argument about there being a particular kind of an excessive amount of funding or a disproportionate amount of funding that was perhaps included centrally. So what I'm arguing for is not a cut in that funding, but a redirection of that funding into other places. And I believe there should be a group of folks who are absolutely responsible, so that there should be offices of inclusive excellence, for example, that help to keep the accountable actually accountable, but that there should be tendrils all the way throughout the university in every aspect of the work that we're doing, that is helping to integrate this work so that it feels like it's the work of all of us. Right? It doesn't feel like it's the work of those people over there who are somehow fixing the so-called problems of their kind, but rather a total shift in mindset so that this is for all of us. We know that the work of inclusive excellence is for all of our excellence. And if we have classrooms that are not reflecting the true diversity of our city, our state, our world, then all of us are really losing out.
You're not new to this fight, but what about for somebody who's new in the workplace at this moment? And I'm thinking about a former Goldman Sachs CEO who recently told CBS that, here's the quote, "Special programs we ran for minorities at the firm were often counterproductive. I think that if you brand something a remedial program, you're kind of also branding the people who got into that program." And that really struck me as just an example of the way that if you're a young person, relatively new in the professional world, and you're in this moment right now with this intense scrutiny on anything having to do with diversity, I guess my question is, what would you advise somebody, a new employee somewhere who does not have the kind of power in their and security in their workplace? Would you advise them to keep their head down about stuff right now?
Before I answer that question, Libby, I have to respond to the quote
Yes, please.
because that the connection between an individual being in a program, a mentorship program, an opportunity program that's meant to help remove barriers and to somehow make that equivalent to being remedial in the space, I think is really just a reflection of their own prejudices here, right?
But it
I
does
think
speak to sort of
it,
what's
yes,
happening in those rooms, right?
yes, absolutely, absolutely. And, I think that the sad piece, so I interview a number of people in this book who have participated in programs such as this and have developed tremendous relationships of mentorship and felt really sponsored by folks. And felt like they could stay in the career, they could stay in the profession because they could see someone doing it, right? The Billie Jean King quote, "You can be it if you can see it." Right. So I just had to kind of start there because I think that connection between somehow being quote unquote remedial, which I think is really problematic anyway, that language and that being that somehow diverse individuals are at odds or not meritorious is a part of the problem. So in terms of telling folks to keep their head down and just to do the work, I think that if we tell people to not use their voices, if we tell them to be silent, then we remove one of the most important tools that we have in our arsenal. I'm arguing, I was a communication professor at the UW for 20 years, and I believe that we need to further our communication skills. Now, that doesn't mean that you aren't very careful and strategic and you're figuring out what is the landscape of things and who feels like a safe person and who isn't. But also being able to speak and to speak out at this moment is incredibly important, right? That's what the whole third chapter is about, learning how to do this thing I call radical speaking, which is inspired by the great Audre Lorde, right? That we are not going to be protected by our silence. We need to instead figure out how do we use our voices, even and especially when it's difficult.
What do you hope happens over the next 5-10 years in this space? Like, is this the nadir of where things could get, or could it get worse? And what do you hope, for the future, I suppose? That is like a very open-ended kind of question, but please take that in whatever direction you'd like to take.
Yeah, yeah. What I hope is that as people are watching the DEI offices disappearing in their company, at their school, that they look around at all of the different places of the organization and think about how can the work of creating a better, more equitable space be my work. So in the places that have not been quote unquote DEI spaces, that should be exactly the ones that are trying to pick up the work on thinking about how do we make justice a part of what we do every day. And that's going to be a fundamental rethinking of all of our work at these institutions. And it's going to mean, for example, in this work of anti-racism, that we have lots of white folks who have not felt comfortable in this space stepping up and speaking out. So that is my hope. That's my goal.
Dr. Relina Joseph is Vice Provost of Inclusive Excellence and Professor of African American Studies at UCLA. The book is Racial Exhaustion: How to Move Through Racism in the Wake of DEI. Dr. Joseph, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. Don't forget you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org or on your favorite podcast app.